Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we're excited to welcome back award-winning author Buddy Levy to discuss his new book, Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. This suspenseful saga tells stories of exploration, human endurance, and a daring rescue. It follows the men who risk their lives piloting experimental flying machines called airships to reach the top of the world, and is filled with triumphs, tragedies, and remarkable resilience. I'd now like to welcome Buddy Levy back to our show.
James, good to see you again.
Yes, I was looking back and I think we interviewed you in December of 2022. It was Empire of Ice and Stone was the book you had just released. And I think the episode that we did came out a couple months later. But yeah, it's been a couple years. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I've been pretty busy, as it turns out. You know, I finished Empire and got right to work on Realm of Ice and Sky. And I had already been doing some preliminary research. But in the interim, I went to Svalbard, which we can get to eventually. But that was the place from which most of these North Pole airship expeditions took off. And I really wanted to make sure I spent some time there. So I spent 3 weeks in Svalbard in June of 23. And it was one of the greatest trips of my life, really.
Yeah, last time we spoke, I think you mentioned that you like to really visit places that you write about.
Absolutely. It's very important to me. And, dating back to really, I wrote a book about Davy Crockett. Was my first narrative history. It was more of a full cradle to grave biography. But even then, I went, in addition to going to the Tennessee State Archives and all of that and the Alamo, I really wanted to get out in the cane breaks and the countryside that Crockett had spent a lot of his youth in. And that was back in 2005, maybe 2004. And since then, I've written books on everything from Cortez and Montezuma and that fateful historic meeting. And I spent weeks traveling the route of the conquistadors. And I wrote a book about the first Europeans, the Spaniard conquistadors, to descend the entire length of the Amazon. And I spent 3 weeks in a dugout canoe floating from the headwaters of the Amazon and Coca, Ecuador, all the way to Iquitos, Peru, about 400 miles, and sleeping in the flooded forest and jungle in a hammock. And so I really like to spend time on the ground and in the places where I'm the explorers that I'm writing about visited, so that I can kind of transport the reader back in time to the extent possible.
Yeah, and the books that you've written are just really action-packed adventure stories, as well as stories about leadership or lack of leadership, really how human endurance is incredible in some cases, and how some people really rise to the top in certain situations that might make other people sort of cower or shrink, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great observation. In every story that I take on that has to do with, many of them are expeditionary. They involve survival in many cases. And you're absolutely right. You've got groups of people who are in usually dire circumstances at some point during the narrative, and things are going wrong. And it's very interesting to look back at history and also apply what you learn about leadership, as you say, because people's true character comes to the fore, I think, when they're up against it. And so you really see the kinds of people, and in many cases, it's quite surprising. People who had been unremarkable in certain respects. They rise and surface as true leaders, and they're selfless in many cases, and then others end up shrinking. And I think you can learn a lot from historical figures and stories about how people handle adversity and difficulties.
Well, talk about difficulties. Your book, Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. The difficulties these individuals came across in these adventures is just astounding. But so the book that you've just written is obviously about polar exploration. It's about ice and snow and really rough conditions. And the book I interviewed you about a couple of years ago was Empire of Ice and Stone. So, you know, as I was reading this book, I'm also up in New Jersey, and we have had one of the coldest, icy winters we've had in a long time. So I'm cold when I'm outside walking the dog, and then I feel cold when I'm reading your book because I had to put a sweatshirt on. I said to my wife, I said, this book is making me freeze to death.
Yeah, it's funny. I have this affinity for the cold that I get asked about, and I've thought about it a lot. I think I can blame my father for some of it. He grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, but he ended up heading west and going to college in Colorado, and he became a Nordic ski racer. Quite amazing. He hadn't seen snow until he was like 17 or 18 years old, and he ended up on the Olympic team and competed in Cortina, Italy. But we moved to Idaho in the early 70s, and my dad was really into the outdoors and hunting and fishing. And so he would take me duck hunting, and I'd be in these cold blinds and at like 20 below zero. And he also gave me the stories of Jack London and Ernest Hemingway. And so I was sort of predisposed. And then I became a skier and a ski racer. And so, I really do have there's something about the cold that reminds you how close you are to danger, actually. I think, and especially in these expeditions where men are falling through the ice periodically, and they have minutes to figure out how to get dry and do something to get warm, keep moving. And so I've always been really fascinated by that. Just the hair breadth distance between life and death that supreme cold brings you to.
Yeah. And, first of all, it's a real credit to the author, you, to bring this atmosphere in your writing, the atmosphere that the reader is in. So descriptive. I actually did feel cold. It just brought me there. But I want to talk about the book Realm of Ice and Sky and the time period that we're looking at in this book. But before we do that, can you just give us a quick overview of what the book is about?
Sure. Yeah, Realm of Ice and Sky essentially is the history of airship exploration toward the North Pole. And by airship, it would be what we think of as today a blimp, but they are referred to as airships or dirigibles. And so you've got this really, essentially, the book chronicles three major figures, which are Walter Wellman, an American journalist who was the first to try this, to fly an airship to the North Pole. And then part two introduces the great Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who is known for having been first to the South Pole, first through the Northwest Passage. And he, at the time, when we meet him in the book, is really one of the most venerated polar explorers in the world. And then he ends up in a rather difficult, what I call an arranged marriage with this Italian airship designer named Umberto Nobile. And so part two chronicles Amundsen and Nobile's attempts. And then the third part, which is kind of the climax of the book, and it deals with the part of the subtitle that is History's Greatest Arctic Rescue, deals with Umberto Nobile's Italian only attempt to the North Pole by airship, and the disaster and rescue that is involved in this debacle that happens at the top of the world.
Well, it is riveting. And back to setting the stage for this book, let's talk about the time period. I think you start to talk about that Walter Wellman. This guy is unbelievable. I'd never heard of Walter Wellman before. I am amazed at this guy. He was fearless. He had so much energy, and he was just like a man way ahead of his time. But I never heard about him before. Let's talk about the time that he lived in. He was born in the 1850s, I think, and some of this adventure started in the 1890s. He started to dabble in adventure. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. James, you're not alone. I had not heard of Walter Wellman either until I stumbled across him doing some research, on one of these polar side journeys that I took. And then I was like, wait, this guy tried to fly an airship to the North Pole in 1906 and seven? What? And then I filed that away, and came back to it. But yeah, so the context is really, and the time frame is really interesting to me. Wellman was a decorated American journalist at the time we meet him in this book. And he was probably the most widely read, one of the most widely read journalists in America of the day. And he was a self-taught guy. He ended up, I think he only went to school till he was about 14 years old. And then he started his own newspaper, eventually became a journalist for the Chicago Record Herald, and he wrote for a number of other papers. And he was, like you say, he had boundless energy and interests and imagination. And so he covered stories about everything from the Transcontinental Railroad, in the 1860s, and the coal and iron magnates and barons. He hobnobbed with Theodore Roosevelt and Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller. He knew all these people, and I like to say that he was a celebrated journalist who had a side hustle as an Arctic explorer. So he was really interested in science and eventually in flight too, because we have to remember that at the turn of the century, manned flight is in its absolute fledgling stages. And so around 1903, the Wright brothers are testing their Wright Flyer at Kitty Hawk, and it's only 3 or 4 years later that Walter Wellman is attempting to fly dirigibles to the North Pole. And at the time, it wasn't really clear whether the airship or the airplane was going to have supremacy of the skies for commercial passenger travel and all sorts of other applications. But yeah, Walter Wellman attempted, and the other thing, James, that I think is really cool about this story is that it's kind of the changing of the guard. We experienced, the traditional dog sled approach to going farthest north and farthest south, right? So you've got guys like Robert Peary and Cook and Amundsen too. Even Walter Wellman, he decided to go to the Arctic and to try to do exploration in the traditional dog sled method. And but as early as 1893, Wellman wrote that airships will solve the mystery of the North Pole and the frozen oceans. And he already was looking skyward, but he kind of wanted to test it out himself. And so he did a number of expeditions from Svalbard, which is about halfway between northern Norway and the North Pole, and Franz Josef Land, this archipelagos up there. And Wellman came back defeated. He nearly lost his leg to gangrene and frostbite, and he realized there must be a better way than beating our heads against the icebergs over and over. And this had been tried, for more than 100 years. And so he started studying flight. And at that point, there were some attempts. There was a crazy Swede named S.A. Andre who attempted to go by balloon. But this craft was it was unpowered, right? So he was completely that was in 1898 or seven, and he was completely at the whims and mercies of the winds, and he floated off to never be seen again for about 30 years. But anyway, Wellman had this grand idea, in part inspired by the developments that were going on in France with the airship innovations and technological advancements. So he had this airship built in France, in Paris, and disassembled, untested, and then took the small crew to ship the airship and people and built this remarkable kind of village, essentially, in one of the most northerly places that you can be. In fact, when I did my research for the book, I went to one of the places that Amundsen and Nobile took off from. It's about 50 miles away from where Wellman took off from, but it's remains to this day the most northerly permanently inhabited town. There's like 35 people, which are in the world. And so it was a really ambitious and audacious idea that was, as you mentioned, quite ahead of its time.
Yeah, so he was successful as a journalist. He didn't probably need the money to do this. He needed money to do it, but he wasn't in need of money to live on. He had that already. So he had to get investors for this as well as using, I guess, some of his own money. But what were his reasons other than excitement?
Great question. It's always interesting to try to get into the mind of these explorers, and they offer plenty of clues from their own writings and from the writings of others who speculate about them. And Wellman was, prolific, and so he wrote about all of his exploration. So he was, as you point out, I think there were a number of things going on. One, you've got incredible ambition and ego. I like to say that these guys had egos the size of airships, essentially, that you kind of have to. But so there's another thing going on with Wellman, which to me is really an important part of this story, and it has to do with everything that was going on at the time with journalism. Walter Wellman was also very interested in novel technological advancements, including the Marconi radio. And wireless communication was at its early stages. And so you've got a guy who is already a good storyteller. He understands that there's scientific importance in trying to, nobody, by the way, has been to the North Pole when we first encounter Wellman in this story. And it's kind of a race to the North Pole. People are trying to do it by ship and dog sled, and then Richard Byrd shows up and the Josephine Ford airplane. You've got all these guys trying to do it in dirigibles, but Wellman understood that the story was really at the heart of this, and there was a real appetite in the reading public for exploration and discovery and heroism. And so, if you could go to the North Pole and back and in an airship and survive, you're going to have fame, you're going to have polar immortality, and you're also going to be able to parlay the expedition and the stories of it into lucrative contracts with books and speaking lecture tours and all sorts of things. And so there were many reasons to want to take the risks that were involved. And, we're also at a moment where James Gordon Bennett and the major newspapers of the day are all jockeying for readership, and they're financing these expeditions. And so it's a really kind of a intense and I guess sexy time in journalism and exploration.
So there are obviously some big rewards on the table for Wellman, which is understandable. He likes adventure. As a matter of fact, he sounds like a kindred spirit to Teddy Roosevelt, doesn't he?
Yeah. In fact, they were chums. Yeah. They used to, Wellman would interview him, for his journalistic pieces, but and there's an anecdote in the book about him. Wellman took a break from his job and from his exploration to zoom up the Nile to be the first journalist to get to Roosevelt and try to talk to him, and he wins the race. But yeah, I think that's a good analogy that they were kindred spirits for sure.
But that's all good. But let's talk about the risk side of the equation. I
Yeah,
tell you, based on, you got to read the book, but you're on the edge of your seat. So, I mean, he's certainly not a trained aeronautical engineer. He's a journalist by trade, but he was a big part of the crew that went on these trips. And they are just wrought with disaster and catastrophe. I mean, you had winds, you had the cold and the effect on the airship. And was it hydrogen these dirigibles were filled with?
that's
Was it
correct.
hydrogen?
Which is, by the way, is highly flammable. And so, I'm really glad you brought up the risk because, you know, in Wellman's first airship, the America, which he had built in France, and I'm glad you point out, he was not a trained aeronautical engineer or designer, but he was a very quick study, and he was a huge part of every aspect of the construction. And he even had a bunch of ideas that he brought to bear on these airships that were they were novel. They were attempts to keep the airship tethered to the ground by using these like 1,200-foot long steel cables, and they had grappling hooks on the ends of them. But you're talking about attaching, a 75 horsepower motor, which, in these days would not even be that. It would power your little aluminum fishing boat around the lake, to a 185-foot long hydrogen filled blimp that looked like a giant cigar, And the idea was that Wellman had studied winds and the climate of Svalbard and the area, and so the plan was to catch this at the right time in summer. Now, I should add that he was always chasing the clock. There's a small window in that far north where the weather is cooperative and not incredibly, just deep winter and dark. So it's basically summer up till the end of August is what you've got. And Wellman was always a little bit behind because they had to build a massive hangar to house this airship. They had to build a plant to fabricate hydrogen, and they've got outbuildings. And then you've got this 185-foot long, 50-foot wide hydrogen filled blimp that you're going to have 30 or 40 men holding these hand lines and then release this thing, hoping to catch a tailwind toward the North Pole. And it's got propellers, 11.5-foot propellers, and a rudder system and all this stuff, but it hasn't even been tested ever. So his first attempts toward the North Pole were actual test flights. You could believe that.
It's crazy. Well, I think the man lived on adrenaline, as is evident in his personal life. He liked risk taking too.
Yes, he did. He had some dalliances and sidebars to his own family, and but like I really, yeah, the idea of getting into, like you say, he hired a couple of guys who also, one of them, this guy Melvin Vanneman, was had been in balloons and airships, and he's a really interesting character. The guy was like an American journeyman who had been an opera singer, and also he had a job when Wellman discovered him. He was a high altitude photographer, and so he was known for climbing up like flagpoles or buildings or going in hot air balloons and doing aerial photography. And so Wellman was introduced to this guy in France, and he was like, he's perfect, he's fearless. And so he gets this guy and this other dude, Felix Reisenberg, and three of them, climb into, in 1907, the main first flight, climb into this dirigible and, take off toward the North Pole, sort of with hope and and enough food for a year in case they crash. It was just wild.
Yeah, the story, the reader has to hear the whole story, but certainly he was a man who, once he failed, he didn't give up though, did he? He was going to make a new plan, and he also extracted his own rewards from it as far as what he had accomplished, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, James, because you know I encountered a lot of, I mean, there isn't a ton written about Wellman. There's only one biography that I found, and then this other scholar who has written a lot about Wellman, but there's not much beyond them. And, he sort of gets footnoted as a crank, a crackpot, and a failure. And I'm trying to, in many ways, or I just view him differently, I guess, because sure, he didn't make it to the North Pole. I'll just go ahead and spoil that for the reader. But I don't view it's sort of like looking at Thomas Edison and saying, well, he tries something 100 times and then eventually he succeeds, but all those failures were leading to something. And Wellman ends up in ways being proven right. He was just ahead of his time. And so what I look at him as a pioneer rather than a failure, because he was just the first to try something, and he was doing so with the earliest technology of the time, which wasn't really quite ready yet. And so you have this gap between Wellman, who, and by the way, there, like I said, there's a really intense, period where people are still trying to get to the North Pole. Robert Peary is the most known, probably, the American, and Dr. Frederick Cook, who are, while Walter Wellman is trying to fly there, those guys are actually out on the ice trying to get there by dog sled. And, you get this intense moment where Wellman discovers or learns that both Peary and Cook have claimed the North Pole. And it's really interesting because history ends up having something to say about whether they actually made it or not. But Wellman doesn't know this, right? And so, like you say, he doesn't really quit. He turns his attentions to the very next thing. And so the minute he learns that Peary, who he believes it was probably Peary, was more likely to have been the one to make it because of his experience. Soon as he learns that Peary has made the North Pole, Wellman, he starts scheming, and he's like, well, I already have an airship. No one has flown across the Atlantic. I'll be the first to do that. And so he then goes and embarks on that project, which is wild. And he ends up being ahead of his time there too. But that all gets covered in the book. You'll learn about it.
It does. It's a great story. Let's move on to Amundsen. This guy, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Amundsen.
Yes. He was like a modern day Viking, I think you describe him as. Can you talk about who this man was and what had he accomplished prior to setting his sights on the North Pole?
Sure. Roald Amundsen is just he has a number of nicknames: the White Eagle of Norway, and the Last Viking. I mean, images of him, and there are a few in the book. I mean, he's just a weathered. He has this really long, hooked nose that made him, and his eyes are piercing and bright, and he kind of looked like an eagle, and his hair prematurely whitens from all of his travails in the north. But so he's a Norwegian guy who was inspired early on by another Norwegian legendary explorer named Fridtjof Nansen. And Nansen's a bit older. When Amundsen was a boy, Nansen is being celebrated because he had been the first to farthest north, and he's a Norwegian national hero. Amundsen had seen Nansen returning from some of his explorations to incredible fanfare, national holidays. And at a very early age, Amundsen, who is highly intelligent, but he didn't have the kind of patience to be scholastically inclined. His mother wanted him to be a doctor, and he sort of went to school at her behest, even though he was bored. But through winter, he would sleep with the windows of his room wide open through the dead of winter in Norway, to harden himself for his future explorations. And he had read all about Sir John Franklin and the Erebus and the Terror and all of the Franklin expeditions. And so and then of course his own countryman Nansen was very inspirational. And so he quit when his mother died. He was in his first or second year of college, and he inherited some money, and he decided, I'm going to quit school and live my dream to be an explorer. And he embarked on like a 6-year apprenticeship to become a ship's captain, which it takes that long to become to get the master mariner certification. And he spent about 6 years sailing all over the world. His rationale was that if he were going to lead expeditions, he would have to be a ship's captain because he didn't want kind of fractured leadership. He wanted to be in complete charge, and he knew this. He went on a pretty famous voyage on a ship called the Belgica in the late 1800s, and overwintered in the Antarctic, the first overwintering. Incidentally, Frederick Cook was also on that ship, and Amundsen meets him then. But anyway, by the time we meet him in Realm of Ice and Sky, Amundsen has beaten Sir Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole, been the first person to navigate completely through the Northwest Passage, which had been sought for hundreds of years. And then, he's kind of on the cusp of retirement, really. He's nearly 50. And he is approached by this American who's another figure in the book who deserves like his own book. I'm interested in him. His name is Lincoln Ellsworth. And so when we meet Amundsen, he's kind of down and out because he's got some financial problems. His lecture tour, he doesn't have the heart for it anymore. He's really disinterested. Nobody's coming to his tour. And gets a phone call in a hotel room in New York by this man named Lincoln Ellsworth, who says, I'm an American kind of entrepreneur who has done some exploring. And Amundsen is sitting there almost going to hang up. Like, I can't even deal with this guy, He's like he thinks he's just a celebrity chaser, But Amundsen's attention is piqued when Lincoln Ellsworth tells him, by the way, I have a lot of money, and I'm interested in supporting an expedition with you, and I can finance it. And it turns out that Ellsworth's father is this industrialist magnate who's got millions of dollars, and he is about to inherit it all from him. And so Amundsen says, well, yeah, let's meet. And they end up trying to fly airplanes in 1925 to the North Pole. And it's there's a couple chapters in the book about this great attempt, which ends on the ice with these men really in dire straits because, they've had to crash land effectively on the ice. And James, one of the things that I don't know that readers are always appreciative of is that it's not like the ice is just this static lake that's sitting there frozen and glassy, like you can ice skate on it. It's rupturing and buckling huge, massive flows of ice that are being pushed and ground and moving with wind and current. And so they're not stationary. And so you never really know exactly where you are. It could move 30 miles overnight, And so anyway, Amundsen, when we meet him, is already legendary. But again, ego and hubris play a role. And he learns that these claims of the North Pole have come to be questioned. And Amundsen then decides, hey, maybe this guy, Walter Wellman, was right. Maybe an airship is the way to do it. And so they set off to buy an airship in 1925. Amundsen and Lincoln Ellsworth have a secret meeting with Italian airship designer Umberto Nobile, who is working for Benito Mussolini's fascist military. And they happen to have a 350-foot long state-of-the-art airship for sale for $100,000. And Ellsworth signs the check with some support from the Norwegian government. But it's an amazing moment, because Amundsen at this point, he has flown in airplanes and he doesn't really know anything about airships, but he figures, I'm going to go into business with the designer of the airship, who also is an expert navigator and pilot, and I'll bring some of my own crew that Amundsen decides he's going to bring some of his crew from his previous ship and dog sled expeditions, who he knows and trusts very well. And then they'll combine with Umberto Nobile's Italian airship experts, mechanics, navigators, pilots, and then together they're going to attempt to fly from Svalbard, from Kings Bay, which is that town I mentioned, that's the most northerly town in the world, to the North Pole. And Amundsen, he has the idea that it would even be more important scientifically to continue on past the North Pole and fly all the way across the polar ocean to Alaska, because this is terra incognita, essentially. No one really has mapped what's out there. And there's a suspicion, or at least a theory, that there might even be an undiscovered landmass or continent out there. And so the idea is to either prove or disprove the existence of this continent and bag the North Pole en route.
That is so fascinating. And that story about that trip is crazy, because you had three different nationalities. You had Italian, you had the Norwegian, and you also had Ellsworth was an American, right?
Well, right. And then it's even more, there's like a Swede or two. And so there are some significant language barriers that are happening. Nobile's English is not great, but because Nobile's main airship crew are Italians, he's speaking mostly to them in Italian. And Amundsen, he sort of has dabbled in, he's got rudimentary language skills in many languages. Being a European, it's kind of part of the deal. But yeah, there's a lot of, the thing that about that first trip in 1926 that's really noteworthy is that it's harrowing, for one thing. First of all, they fly. I should add that there have been significant developments in the airship technology from the time of Wellman's day. So Wellman, in 1907, 8, 9, is tinkering with his 75 horsepower motor. By now, you've got 350-foot long airships, still hydrogen filled, but they have 3 250 horsepower motors, and they're able to go now, whereas Wellman's airship could go about 15 to 20 miles an hour. These can now go 50 to 70, depending on the wind situation. And so they're much faster, they're much more stable, and they have better navigational tools. So, the craft is better suited, but there are still all sorts of potential problems, because, when you get airship ice, when you get the conditions up there, of course, you've got mist and fog and freezing rain and variable temperatures contingent on your altitude. And so they encounter all sorts of things like ice forming around the outside of the outside of the airship is called the envelope, the gas bag, the thing that you see that's filled. And that thing, if you've ever seen like icing on the wing of an airplane, you get icing around encasing the entire airship, and it starts to drop out of the sky, essentially. And so then they have to do all sorts of things, like even some men climb out onto ladders that are on the outside of the airship. And they're tied in with ropes, but then they're knocking ice off of a moving airship a few thousand feet above the polar sea. It's incredible.
I think you mentioned that when the airship got too high in altitude, it affected the hydrogen in the dirigible.
So you can have there's something called pressure height, and I'm not an airship expert, but I learned a great deal. There's something called pressure height, which is the height at which there's an equilibrium between the pressure of the hydrogen inside the envelope or the balloon, and then the outside atmosphere. And if you exceed that, you can have rupture. You can either have the airbag or the envelope. It will separate. I mean, this is like, nylon and rubberized fabric, so it can burst. At which point you will just plummet to the sea or earth wherever you're above, or there can be explosion. Everyone remembers the Hindenburg, and that takes place in just about 10 years exactly after Amundsen and Nobile are making their attempt to fly to the North Pole. You also have like gasoline powered motors that are connected to flammable hydrogen, which creates some potential dangers. But for the most part, I would say that the Hindenburg kind of ruined airship travel for until now, which it's back, and we'll get to that in a minute. But for the most part, they were relatively safe, but not without. Amundsen and Nobile's flight is incredibly harrowing at the end, and I won't say exactly everything about it, but they encounter like the worst possible weather, including hurricane force winds, freezing rain, fog, mist, and so they're flying over land and near shore where they can't actually see the peaks, and so you've got potential crashes into the mountainside, and they're being blown around for days. Really, it's incredible.
It is. And of course, you get into sort of the egos that clash together after that expedition. And then you get into a third expedition, which does involve Nobile, his name was, right?
Yes, right. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Amundsen and Nobile, I call it an arranged marriage that ended in divorce. Even though their expedition was, by all accounts, a resounding success. And there should have been spoils enough to go around and laurels for everyone, but you've got competing egos. So there's kind of a race to the press after they get back on the ground. And, you got the Italian, there's national pride involved. So the Italians are taking credit for, this whole expedition success. The Norwegians trying to take credit. They're on separate speaking tours, and it ends up being kind of it's a spat in public that gets really ugly. And Amundsen writes this book too quickly that's really mean spirited about Nobile. So Nobile ends up saying, "Well, the heck with it. I'm going to go ahead, and I don't need Amundsen. He was just a paid passenger, even though he's the greatest explorer of all time." And so just 2 years later, Nobile, in another airship, the Italia, and I should mention that the first one that he and Amundsen took was called it was the N1 or the Norway. It got named Norway. And so the next one, of course, Nobile names the Italia, and he's going to try to take an almost exclusively Italian crew, though there was a Czech and a Swede, also these scientists, and do it himself to prove that the Italians didn't need Amundsen anyway. And without spoiling too much, because this is really the most dramatic part of the whole book is what befalls the flight of the Italia. And I'll just say that they end up on the ice, and in a remarkable moment where there is a crash in which the Italia is losing altitude and they can't get it to rise anymore. And there's a part of the airship on the bottom, which is the control car, where the most of the men who are running, there are people in the engine gondolas, which are attached to the sides of the airship. There are actually 3 men in those. And then there's a bunch of men in this control car that rides at the bottom of the airship. That thing hits the ice at about, 20 or 30 miles per hour, tearing it away from the rest of the airship, leaving 9 men on the ice. And then the airship envelope goes floating away with 6 other men still inside the framework of it, sort of throwing boxes and crates off to the others. And, it just floats away into the ether and mist, never to be seen again, with these men in it. And so you're left with 9 men. There's fractured bones. Nobile has a broken leg. Another man is has broken limbs, and no one knows exactly where they are. And so that's really the intensity, is that one of the men had the wherewithal to leap with the backup handheld wireless radio. So they set up this antenna and a radio station on the moving ice and start sending out SOS signals to the world. And so you have this incredible, I cut back and forth between what's happening to the men on the ice and what's happening in the developing rescue attempts to find them. Because when they don't return to Kings Bay, Svalbard, the world now knows something has gone woefully wrong. And there's all sorts of speculation. And then it prompts or launches the largest rescue operation in Arctic history, involving like 1,400 men, airplanes, airships, ski troops, basically all. And out of retirement comes Roald Amundsen to attempt to save the day and fly into history and go be the first to find Nobile. He puts aside his squabbles and says, "I'll go," and he hires a French crew and jumps on an airplane and flies off to go try to find Nobile.
You know, I am going to resist asking you any more questions about the book because I want people to buy it and read it. Now, here's the thing. After having read two of your books now, this is my opinion, and this isn't false flattery here. You are the best possible nonfiction writer because what you're doing is you are a combination of a great storyteller and a fabulous researcher, because I am just amazed at the not dull detail, but exciting detail that you work and weave through this story, where it really rivets the reader to their seat. You feel like you're actually in the airship with these people and experiencing what they're experiencing. How did you go about getting all this information and then really just weaving it into this great story?
Oh, well, I really appreciate that, James. Thanks so much. Yeah, to me, it's I like to try to bring history to life so that the reader feels like they're on the expedition as well. And I also like to have a kind of cinematic feeling so that it feels like you're watching a movie to a degree. Now, in order to do that, of course, you have to read everything that's been written. I mean, to the extent possible, everything that has ever been written about the subject. That's A. And I've been very fortunate, of course, in that a lot of records in the explorations and expeditions that I've written about have been retained from these trips. And so you've got firsthand diaries, log books, journals, sometimes military, manuals and journals that were kept, which included so much detail. A lot of these were scientific in nature. And so you've got, what the temperature was at a certain time on a given day, what the wind speeds were, what the weather was like. It's being recorded and described. And then so coupling that with going to the places myself, so that if I'm in Svalbard and hiking up in the mountains where 50 miles from where, let's say, Wellman crashed one of his airships, and you can get a pretty good idea what it might have felt like to those people who were actually there, because not that much has changed in these far remote places, really. And encountering things like I saw a couple of polar bears, which was really intense. I mean, I was on a ship, so there was no danger there, but I camped in a place in Svalbard where in 2020 a Dutch man was mauled to death by a polar bear. And it's like you want to be sort of on the edge. I'm not making the claim that I am anywhere near an explorer of the magnitude of the people that I write about, but I do like to dabble so that my reader feels like they're getting a taste of it.
I think that's fantastic. Well, I highly recommend Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue by Buddy Levy. Buddy, how can people find out more about ordering this book and also about the other books that you have written?
Sure, appreciate it. Yeah, I have a website, buddylevy.com, and my books are sold in independent bookstores and wherever books are sold. It's pretty easy to find me on the internet.
Yeah, and finally, you've got to have something else cooking up. Is it going to
Well,
stay cold?
I'm actually thinking of moving. Oh, my wife wants me to get off the ice, so that we can go somewhere warm and something jungle or desert next. Though I have to say, I'm still intrigued by shipwreck. A couple of my books, Labyrinth and Empire, involves some shipwreck, and I just really like the idea of being marooned. The idea of being stranded. And so I'm still in the research stages. So I'll get back to you when the next one pops and we can talk about how I got there.
Well, I'm really looking forward to your next book, and I want to dig back into some of the other ones that you spoke about. Davy Crockett is somebody who interests me a lot. So,
Well, that's great. My publisher, Diversion, who I work with, St. Martin's for the ice books, and I have another publisher, Diversion Press, that is reissuing the book on Crockett, and it's coming out on March 11th. So we'll get you a copy of that, and maybe we can chat about it.
I would love to. I would love to. Buddy, this has been great. I love your book, and I still maintain that I had to put a sweatshirt on when I read it. That's how realistic it is to me.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really always like being on, and keep doing the great work that you all are doing.
Buddy, thank you very much, and have a great day.
You too.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.